Impact Teams Radio. Welcome to Impact Teams Radio, the show where we explore what it takes to be a leader of the leaders in corporate America. Get ready to be inspired and discover proven tips for going from average to exceptional. Now, here's your host and guide, Tony Sherman.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Impact Teams Radio. I'm your host and guide, Tony Sherman. And this week we have Howard Shaw. We'll introduce Howard in a minute, but I just want to get back to the fundamentals here, guys. What are we talking about with Impact Teams Radio? This is leaders leading leaders. So the objective here, as you listen, is for you to take out the leadership nuggets that you can inculcate into the next 6 months into your growth in your corporations as you are today, so that you're a better leader in 6 months' time, you're better prepared, and these things become habits before you need them. So as you listen to myself and Howard work out in this episode, the arc of the hero, what I need you to be doing is taking notes. And as always, please, if you like what you're hearing, leave us a review on iTunes, because that's how we get the message out to the rest of the world. Obviously, you can always pop on the blog and leave comments there. But anyway, let me step back slightly and say, Howard, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So Howard is the president of the Activate Group, and I'm sure the Activate Group is pretty much what it is. It's activating leaders, which should be exciting to all our listeners. But before we start to dive into the arc of the hero here and look at your story and your wins and your losses and so forth, let me just ask you, Howard, if you'd spend a minute or two and introduce yourself to our listeners.
So a little bit about myself. From a hobby standpoint, I like to travel a lot. My wife and I, we do a special trip every year with the kids and without the kids. And the whole 20 years we've been married, we found it important to go to somewhere in the world we'd never been. So we've been doing that every year for 20 years, and we do a trip with them and without them. So that's one of our rituals. And if you haven't been, our last trip was Budapest, Prague, and Vienna. And I'll tell you, Prague was probably one of our most special places. I'm also been an exercise person my entire life. Joined my first gym when I was 13 years old. And I would walk or take a bus, but I would walk approximately about 2 miles 3 days a week when I was 13 just to go to the gym. And I've been weightlifting, playing basketball, yoga, and other forms of exercise my entire life, and even have a complete gym in the house here. So I'm one of those people that believe that the most important thing is meeting of the day is exercise. So and I've been married 22 years, got a son 16 and another son 13 years old. They keep me pretty busy.
I am sure they do. First of all, congratulations on being married over 2 decades. That, in this day and age, is a major achievement. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So we like to ask people for a quote or two. What quotes at the moment sort of sticks in their mind, or what shapes their philosophy? So have you got a quote or two for our listeners, Howard?
I do. So so the first one is, sound strategy starts with having the right goal, and that's by Michael Porter. And the second one is, trust is the glue of life. It's the most essential ingredient in effective communication. It's the foundational principle that holds all relationships, and that's Stephen Covey. Well,
you grabbed two major giants of business thinking in the 20th century, so that can't. And I do like the strategy. I do like the strategy one straight away. And I'm sure as we get into this, we'll learn a bit more about the trust one, because you're right. If you're going to run an effective team, trust is the glue, isn't it?
Correct.
So we like to start with a mindset of wins. So, Howard, why don't you look back over the arc of your career and pick out 1 or 2 success stories of how you succeeded in business and what that taught you about leadership, and what our listeners can take away, some leadership nuggets from that.
All right, so I've got a couple. I guess the first one I would take was my very, very first business I owned. I was 18 years old. I sold it when I was 21. And God, I wish I knew then what I know now. I ran as fast as I could, and I grew the business very, very rapidly. And after I sold it, I kind of looked back and I realized that there were a lot of things that I wished I had known. And the first one was, I really did not understand how finance worked in my business. and I didn't understand how my books worked. And actually, that's why I actually became a CPA. I actually have a strong background in finance now, but back then, believe it or not, this CPA never looked at his books, never understood how everything happened, and I've never let that happen again. I was kind of surprised how little I understood about my books. The second one that I took away from there, and actually it helped me be very successful, but it wasn't until later in life that I understood how important it was in that business. But the relationships that I had with my employees, the culture I built, was so critical to the extra effort that they gave me. During my entire tenure that I had my business, I never lost one of my key people. I only lost people that I wanted that were never performing and got rid of them quickly. But the key to that was, and it gets back to that trust ingredient in my quote, was the relationships I was able to build with them caused them to always give me extra effort. I never, ever had to ask anybody really hard to work overtime or to do special things, and I pushed that back to the relationship. My second experience was just kind of looking back at what helped me elevate my career throughout. So I had a stint before going back to being a business owner where I worked in several major companies. And as I grew in those companies, I can't think of a year where I didn't get a promotion. And I started asking myself why that happened. And the first thing is I elevated every single role that I was in. So I never looked at a role and said, tell me how it's supposed to be done, and then just do it the way people told me how to do it. I looked at each role. I asked them how it's been done in the past, but then I always asked myself and challenged myself, how do I elevate this role to another level? And then I always elevated it. So if you look at any single role that I was in, whether it was the head of strategic planning of Ryder System, I was also in charge of mergers and acquisitions in Ryder System. An example on the mergers and acquisitions was when I took over the role, the person that had been in the job before had been doing a good job supporting the division, but when I looked at the role, it wasn't adding as much value to the CEO of that division as it should. And they were looking at way too many transactions and not doing enough deals. And I asked the question, so how can we flip that and really help the company? And within a short 6-month period, we flipped that around so that we're looking at a lot less deals but doing all of them. And we eventually grew that division from $400 million to $600 billion and sold it for a commanding multiple. And a big part of that was helping that division understand the strategy of doing mergers and acquisitions in a different way and elevating that role.
That's amazing. So I want to deep dive a little bit into that. But let me step back to I'm very intrigued by this first small business that you had from the age of 18 to 21. First of all, what was the business?
All right, so it was typesetting and graphic design, and typesetting doesn't exist anymore. So actually, another funny lesson from that is make sure you pick an industry that's not going to die in the next 5 years.
Well, that was Steve Jobs probably took it out from under you on that one. And how many staff were you running?
So at one point I had as many as 15, and that's when I got rid of it.
That's amazing that a young entrepreneur of 18 can grow a business that quickly in 3 years to run 15 people. Well done.
Thank you.
So, okay, so we take that. That was just my pure curiousness. My curious nature was just like, okay, wow, that's amazing that you were doing that at 18. So then when you look at elevating, I love your concept, and our listeners should really think about this. If there's one takeaway in today's episode, I like the pure concept of, in fact, this will probably be the title of the episode, how to elevate your role. So I would ask you, as you were looking at those mergers and acquisitions and the obvious roles that you'd had beforehand, what is your personal approach when you move into a job, as well as you laid out defining how to do it? How do you then elevate it? How do you work out that your elevation or your enhanced perception is the right one? And then how do you execute on that?
Okay, so now this gets back to the Michael Porter quote. So you have to start with the right goal, and then you can come up with a sound strategy. So the first thing you should ever do when you enter any kind of a role is ask lots of questions. So the worst thing you can do is think you're smarter than everybody else. And so whenever I ever entered a role, I interviewed everyone. And so when I went into the mergers and acquisitions role, I actually I talked to the person that did the role in the past. I met with all the key constituencies that I would be working with. I even went out and did everything I could to learn a little bit about the business. So I spent several weeks out in the field. I rode on buses because it was the bus division that I was doing it for. I went out to facilities. I went and visited different places. I went and met with everybody who had worked on deals in the past to understand why ones happened, one didn't happen. I then went and I did some research, and it took me about 6 months, not 6 months, 2 to 3 months to really get a good handle on what was going on. Whenever you do your research, then you ask yourself, what would be key levers? What would be things that people want to change? And then you just ask them. So if this were to be done better, what would happen? And so the division's president's answer would be, I need to do deals. And then you start asking your questions, well, why are we not doing deals? And then you start asking other questions, why do things take so long? And you start throwing out the questions, and then you start asking yourself, which ones would have the biggest value to the entity that you're working with? Then your job is to go back and figure out how can you influence that and where's the bottlenecks. And so I always went back and I figured out what was the bottleneck and how could I contribute to removing the bottleneck and how could I show if others are contributing to that, how do we remove it? And I would just always work backwards.
Actually, that is brilliant. The one thing that's going through my mind, like a yes but, because I can't argue with anything you just said, but the emotional reservation I've got in this, I'm assuming that this was a fairly significant role that you're being moved into. How did you find the time to do all of that, as well as the day-to-day responsibilities? Or did you have an incredible amount of autonomy that you could just decide to do this? I'm assuming this was a fast-moving department before you moved in. Maybe not effective, but busy.
So you are totally correct. And actually, ironically, if I just take that one role as I'm thinking back, so when they gave me that role, it was actually never supposed to be mine. Actually, when they put me in that role, they said, you know, Howard, this is going to be temporary. You have no experience doing this. You're not qualified to do this job. We're going to go hire somebody to do it, but can you actually plug a hole for us while we go find the guy? And after that 90 days of my coming up with a solution, the division president came back and said, this is our guy. So I believe you create your opportunities. And in my particular case, yeah, I had to spend a few hours in the beginning on weekends and nights to try to figure it out. But the other thing is usually people are burning a lot of time, wasting energy. And so if you start pinpointing where the problems are, you will actually find that about 50% of the time people are doing stuff, they're active, but they're not productive. And so if you can reshift that energy to something productive, you'll actually win in the end.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think what you just modeled there with a few extra hours, and I'm putting few in air quotes here, which doesn't work too well on the radio, but a few extra hours on the evenings and weekends. Zig Ziglar has this well-known saying, which is what you do off the job defines on how high you go on the job. And I think you just gave us a model of that, if you will.
Correct.
So those are a couple of wins. Let's flip the coin over and look at the other side. As you were developing a leader, have you had one or two losses that have really taught you valuable lessons in your career?
Oh, my goodness. You guys have all day? You got to imagine with all of those trying to elevate things, I had a few train wrecks in my career, and I got to guarantee you I'm going to have a few more. And by the way, I've always felt that anybody who's worked for me that doesn't run into any mistakes or have any problems are usually not worth a damn. When I left Ryder, I went to a company called AutoNation, and I got to be honest with you, I didn't do my homework. I saw a shiny, nice, little exciting new position that was going to double my compensation, and it was an exciting, on paper, opportunity to create change in an organization. I didn't ask any questions. I got all excited about the shiny opportunity. I didn't do my due diligence, and I stepped into hell. I got into a role where they wanted me to be seen and not heard, and the organization was not really even committed to this project that they put me in charge of. I had very little understanding of what I was going to be up against, and more importantly, I knew nothing about the culture I was about to enter. Had I done my homework, I would have found out that what I was about to venture down, they had started and stopped 3 times previously. I would have found that I did not fit that culture, and that was a very painful year of my career. We got a lot done, and I got a lot of great results when I was there, but it was a very, very painful year for me, and I eventually got terminated. And it was because they ended the project, and I was not a fit for that organization. So my learning lesson there was, not number one, not to just look at opportunities. You have to look at what's around it, and after having such a long track record, you can't beat every tidal wave. And so you have to understand what you're going to be up against, and have to understand how well you fit up against those challenges. And sometimes there's some you should go against, and there's some you shouldn't. That was one I definitely should not have gone against, and I learned a very, very important lesson. And actually, I just got to share that with a client today who is thinking about changing roles. The second one, I found myself in a place where I reported to a person who had some serious internal issues. He was the president of the company. He was very selfish, and he was also didn't have the same ethical standards as I did. And so it was very challenging for me to have to work for somebody that that had those types of issues. And what I took away from that experience was I really learned how to deal with people with a boss like that. And it's really stretched my skill set in terms of how to have difficult conversations and how to approach someone that may not be playing with the same set of rules as you will, and also may not be as centered as you might be. And before I might have been more direct, I actually learned how to have those conversations. So it was a pretty big growing experience for me. But I will tell you that tenure in that organization was pretty tough.
Oh, I can imagine. In fact, yeah, I don't know I would have survived in that kind of environment. But stepping back to your first lesson there, I'd be interested. Obviously, when you were with that company as going into the operations role, and then you found out that they weren't committed necessarily to the project the way you thought, the culture wasn't a match. Have you thought through, not only, you obviously came up with some good questions, but have you thought about how you would approach that in future if you were going to go back into employment? I know you run a highly successful consultancy now, but if you're going to go back into employment, how would you approach that in terms of the interview process? Because what I'm thinking about is typically an interview process, especially for a senior role, is fairly straightforward, and it's a funnel where you might walk down, you have multiple interviews, and pretty much the objective is to get over that hurdle and into the next one. And some of the questions that you're asking, I would struggle to ask those diplomatically in an interview environment. If you had to do that again, how would you approach that?
Well, it's funny. I have to do that every day and every week now, because when you're a consultant or a coach and you're going out and trying to get projects, you're basically going in for interviews on a regular basis, and you're always looking for your next job, so to speak. And what I learned from that experience is not to be afraid to ask those questions. So there are many opportunities that I walk away from now. I'll say about 50% of the companies that I talk to, or people that I talk to that may want to hire me, I may walk away because I asked the right questions today, because I'll find out that the environment or culture is such that I can't win, or the situation is one that it's not a winnable situation, that they're not willing to make the changes that they need to make. But I will now ask those questions and not be afraid to ask those questions. And the fear of asking the right questions is an illusion. If you're talking to somebody and you can't ask diplomatically good questions to make a good decision to go and work there, then you should really be questioning whether that's a place you want to work. The reality, though, is you have to learn how to ask those questions in a right way and the timing. So in a first interview, you may not want to ask some of the really tough ones, but in the second interview, when they've made the decision they want you, then I think the rules change. And at that point, I think it's fair to ask. And these are the questions that I would have asked in that particular situation after they decided they wanted me. So why hasn't that project gotten done in the past, and what headwinds am I going to run into? I would have also asked them what are some of the things I'm going to run into in the culture that may prevent me from getting my job done. I would have also talked to a bunch of the former people that I used to work with in my previous company that work there, and found out how my style would have fit within the style of that company, and find out some of the cultural aspects that they probably never would have told me in the interview. But I knew people that worked there. The reason that they called me was my track record in the previous place. And so I knew people working there that would have told me the information I needed to know, but I didn't reach into my relationships because I was just confident that I can conquer anything. Usually you can reach out to people and you can get the data that you need if you go and ask the right questions.
That's a masterclass in how to make sure not only you get a job, but you get the right job. Thank you so much, Howard. That was brilliant. So I've been so focused on your answers. I've just realized that we've banged up against the time for this episode. But before I let you go, I would ask you, what kind of style did you have, or did you have mentors, or have you learned from books, or did you learn from situational leaders? How did you grow to be the leader that you are today?
So I believe I haven't stopped. I've hired a number of coaches during my career. I currently participate in a mastermind group, and then I do have people that I call my inner circle that I reach out to on a regular basis.
And just taking notes here, because that's really interesting. I'm at the moment shaping up some teachings on the 3 ways to get ahead in any career. And it's based around find yourself some mentors, set up a mastermind group, and if you're truly serious, get yourself a coach. And what I heard is you're doing all 3 of those at the moment.
Correct. And I'll tell you, my number one secret that I learned from my mentors, my coaches, and all of that is, and it's actually a secret to happiness, and I think personal growth, and it makes everything so much easier, and it's the importance of nurturing and developing a number of strong key relationships.
Actually, and I would say that in our life, the currency of life is relationships. That's the true currency. How you treat people, how you develop deep relationships. So I resonate with that very closely, Howard. So I think we've come to the end of this episode. We'd like to have you back and learn some more stuff about your leadership philosophies, if that's okay, Howard.
I would love to be back.
Excellent, excellent. So, Impact Nation, until next week, there have been so many lessons. I pulled out 1 or 2 at the beginning, and then, as you know, I started to take notes myself. So I'm hoping, guys, that you will go back, listen to this episode again, and take some notes for yourself, and take some of these gems and put them into your daily practice. But as well as the lessons that we've had during this episode, I would ask you to think about, do you have mentors? Are you part of a mastermind group? And do you have a coach? Because those 3 tools will catapult your leadership in corporate America. Until next week, this is Tony Sherman from Impact Teams Radio, signing off.
That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. Now go and apply these few gems. Make the wisdom you have heard your own. If you want to be part of our launch success, then please go to impactteamsradio.com/love and tell the world. If you want more and never want to miss a beat, please go to impactteamsradio.com/subscribe. If you have 3 minutes, we would love to see a positive review on iTunes. And until next time, remember to act on what you've learned, and you'll be ahead of most of the world. Impact Teams Radio.